Have you ever felt like you're the only responsible one in your family? The one who always follows the rules, pays your way, and somehow still ends up getting the short end of the stick? Well, that was my reality for years until one document changed everything. The morning my parents suggested I should pay full market price for our family home while my sister continued living there, rent-free, was the moment I realized family loyalty has its limits. I sat at their kitchen island in Oakwood Heights, the same granite countertop where we'd celebrated countless milestones, as they casually explained why Melissa deserved special treatment, just until she gets back on her feet. 3 years of free living apparently wasn't enough. What my parents didn't realize was that I had the original property deed in my possession, along with proof of the $67,000 I'd secretly invested in home improvements over the years. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards. My name is Linda Chen. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the dependable daughter, the one who made sensible choices, pursued a stable career in urban planning, and never caused my parents a moment of worry. My older sister Melissa, on the other hand, has mastered the art of charming her way through life's challenges while leaving others to handle the consequences. Don't get me wrong, I love my sister. But after years of witnessing the imbalance in how we were treated, something inside me finally snapped. I remember the exact moment when everything began to unravel with perfect clarity. It was an unusually warm April morning in Connecticut, the kind where spring suddenly asserts itself after months of gray winter. Dogwoods were blooming along the streets of our suburban neighborhood, their white flowers bright against the clear blue sky. I'd driven in from my apartment in New Haven for what I thought would be a routine Sunday brunch with my family. The first since returning from a conference in Seattle the week before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you! The two-story colonial I grew up in stood just as impressive as always. Meticulously maintained garden beds bursting with spring tulips, fresh beige paint with crisp white trim, and the cobblestone walkway my father had installed himself 20 years ago. When I pulled into the circular driveway, I immediately noticed Melissa's brand new Audi parked near the front door, glistening in the morning sun. A vehicle that seemed wildly extravagant for someone who constantly reminded our parents about her financial struggles as a newly single mother. My sensible hybrid looked almost apologetic beside it, though ironically, I was the one with healthy savings and retirement accounts. As I gathered the pastries I'd picked up from our favorite local bakery, I caught sight of my reflection in the car window. At 32, I looked put together in my casual weekend outfit. Dark jeans, a light sweater, and minimal jewelry. My straight, black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and I wore just enough makeup to look polished without appearing to have tried. Years in professional settings had taught me the value of understated competence. People tend to underestimate quiet Asian American women in my field, something I'd learned to use to my advantage. I approached the front door with the familiar mixture of love and mild anxiety that family visits often provoked. Before I could knock, fragments of conversation drifted through the partially open window. My parents and Melissa were already deep in discussion, their voices carrying clearly in the morning air. "I just don't think it's sustainable to keep giving Melissa special treatment," my father was saying, his tone concerned but firm. "Olivia's been asking about buying the house for over a year now. We need to be fair." "But, David, you know how hard things have been since the divorce," my mother replied. "Melissa needs our support with the kids. Olivia doesn't have those responsibilities. She has that promotion at the planning commission. She can afford to pay market value." "It's been almost 3 years, Linda," my father countered. "And Olivia has been helping with repairs and maintenance all this time without complaining." "Olivia always lands on her feet," Melissa chimed in, her voice taking on the slightly theatrical quality I recognized from childhood. The tone she used when she was about to get her way. She's Miss Perfect with her perfect job and perfect credit score. This house means more to me and the kids right now. We need stability. I stood frozen on the porch, a chill spreading through me. Despite the warm spring air, they were discussing the future of our family home, a future that directly affected me, without my input. I had been saving for years to eventually buy the house from my parents when they retired. I'd even been quietly making improvements to maintain and increase its value. Meanwhile, Melissa had been living there completely rent-free since her divorce, while somehow affording luxury cars, designer clothes, and frequent weekend getaways. For a moment, I considered turning around, getting back in my car, and driving away. Confrontation had never been my strong suit. I'd spent a lifetime being the peacekeeper, the reasonable one, the daughter who didn't make waves. But something stopped me. Perhaps it was the culmination of years of unequal treatment, or maybe it was simply the realization that nothing would change if I kept playing by the same old rules. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the doorbell. The conversation inside abruptly halted. Footsteps approached, and then my mother opened the door, her expression shifting quickly from surprise to a welcoming smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. At 62, Linda Chen remained elegant and vibrant, her shoulder-length black hair now streaked with silver, her face showing minimal signs of aging thanks to a rigorous skincare routine. "Olivia, we weren't expecting you until 11, she said, embracing me with the familiar scent of her jasmine perfume momentarily enveloping me. It was 10:45. "I finished my errands early and picked up pastries from Riverside Bakery," I replied, stepping into the foyer and holding up the box as evidence. "I hope that's okay." The house smelled of coffee and my mother's signature lemon blueberry muffins, her standard offering when difficult family discussions were on the agenda. My father appeared from the kitchen, his tall frame slightly stooped now that he was in his mid-60s, but his expression as kind and steady as always. "Perfect timing," he said, giving me a warm hug. "We were just talking about family matters." "I heard," I said simply, meeting his eyes directly. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face before he smiled again. "Well, now we can include you in the conversation. Come in, coffee's fresh." Melissa emerged from the kitchen, casually elegant, in what appeared to be new designer loungewear, her honey blonde hair, recently highlighted I noted, falling in perfect waves around her shoulders. At 35, my sister remained strikingly beautiful, with our mother's delicate features and our father's height. Where I took after our father's side of the family with my straight black hair and more angular face, Melissa had inherited our mother's softer appearance, along with her flair for drama. "Hey, Liv," she said, using the childhood nickname I'd outgrown years ago. "You're early." Her tone suggested mild accusation rather than welcome, and I noticed her eyes dart quickly to our parents, a silent communication passing between them. "Traffic was light," I replied, moving past her toward the kitchen. "How are the kids?" "At their dad's this weekend," she said, following me. "They'll be disappointed they missed you." The kitchen was flooded with morning light from the large windows overlooking the backyard where we'd played as children. The space had been renovated 5 years ago, a project I had helped coordinate and partially fund as a gift to my parents for their 30th anniversary, though Melissa had taken most of the credit for the design choices. 4 places were already set at the kitchen island, my mother's best plates and cloth napkins suggesting this wasn't meant to be a casual brunch. I placed the pastry box next to the fruit platter and took my usual seat, the second stool from the left. My father sat at the head of the island while my mother and Melissa sat opposite me. An uncomfortable silence settled over us as my mother poured coffee. I decided to address the elephant in the room directly. "So," I said, accepting the mug my mother handed me. "You were discussing the house and what happens when you and Dad move to Florida." My parents exchanged glances. My direct approach had always unsettled them. In a Chinese-American household that valued harmony and indirect communication, My straightforwardness often came across as confrontational. "Yes," my father finally said, his tone careful. We've been planning to downsize once I fully retire next year. And I've expressed interest in buying the house for over a year now," I continued, maintaining eye contact. "I've been saving for the down payment and researching mortgage options." "We know, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice taking on the soothing tone she used when preparing to deliver disappointing news. "And we appreciate your interest. But there are family considerations we need to balance." "Like what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Your sister's situation is complicated right now," she replied, glancing at Melissa, who immediately adopted an expression of practiced vulnerability. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The divorce settlement still hasn't been finalized, and uprooting the children from their home and school district would be traumatic for them." "I understand that," I said, keeping my voice level. "But Melissa has been living here rent-free for almost 3 years now. I'm not suggesting she move out immediately, but if I purchase the house, there would need to be a formal arrangement." "That's what we were discussing," my father explained. "If you buy the house at market value, we thought perhaps you could allow Melissa to continue staying here at a significantly reduced rent, just until she gets back on her feet." I took a slow sip of my coffee, processing what they were actually proposing. "So I would take on a mortgage of roughly $575,000 based on current market values, plus property taxes and maintenance costs, while Melissa continues to live here paying." "What exactly?" My mother shifted uncomfortably. "Well, given her current financial constraints with the children's activities and school expenses." "You're suggesting she continues to live here for free," I finished for her, "while I pay the full mortgage, taxes, and upkeep." "Not forever," Melissa interjected, leaning forward. "Just until the divorce is settled and I can reassess my situation. Maybe a year or 2. "On top of the 3 years you've already been here without contributing?" I asked, unable to keep a hint of disbelief from my voice. "That's different," she countered, her expression hardening slightly. "Mom and Dad own the house outright. There's no mortgage now, but you've just gotten that big promotion at the commission. Everyone knows government positions in your field are stable and well paid." The assumption that I should shoulder the entire financial burden because I had been responsible with my career and finances stung deeply. Yes, I had recently been promoted to Senior Urban Planning Director for the county. Yes, I lived within my means and had saved diligently, but that was through careful planning and consistent work, not luck or favoritism. What none of them knew was that over the past 8 years, I'd been quietly investing in real estate on the side, starting with a small foreclosed condo I'd renovated myself on weekends, then leveraging that equity into other modest investments. What had begun as necessity, property in our area was too expensive for me to buy without creative approaches, had grown into something substantial, a small portfolio of 4 rental units that provided significant supplemental income. I'd kept these investments private, partly because I valued my financial independence, and partly because I knew exactly what would happen if my family discovered them. Exactly what was happening now, even without that knowledge. "I've also put considerable money into this house already," I pointed out. "The kitchen renovation, the new heating system, the bathroom updates. Those were significant investments." "Those were gifts," my mother said dismissively. "You offered to help with those projects. We never asked you to contribute." I bit my tongue, holding back the reminder that Melissa had taken credit for coordinating the kitchen renovation, despite contributing nothing financially and showing up only for the final design decisions. "Look," my father said, clearly trying to be the voice of reason, "we're not asking you to decide right now. We just wanted to discuss options that would work for everyone in the family." "Everyone in the family," I repeated, the phrase striking me as particularly ironic, meaning primarily what works best for Melissa. "That's not fair, Liv," Melissa said, her voice taking on the wounded tone that had worked so effectively on our parents throughout our childhood. "I'm a single mother trying to provide stability for my children. Not all of us have had your advantages." "What advantages are those exactly?" I asked, genuinely curious about what disadvantages she perceived in her own life. "You've always been the smart one," she replied, as though this explained everything. "School was easy for you. You got scholarships. You've always known exactly what you wanted to do with your life. Some of us have had to figure things out through trial and error." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. The trials and errors she referred to included dropping out of 3 different college programs my parents had fully funded, a series of jobs she'd quit when they became too demanding, and a marriage to a successful attorney that had ended largely due to her extravagant spending habits. My academic scholarships had come after years of dedicated study. My career path had developed through consistent hard work and strategic planning. None of it had been handed to me or come easily, despite her perception. "I think what your sister means," my mother interjected, clearly trying to smooth over the tension, "is that different people have different strengths. Your strength has always been independence. Melissa's strengths lie in other areas." I took a deep breath, feeling a familiar pattern settling into place. Throughout our lives, this dynamic had played out countless times. Melissa wanted something. My parents enabled her, and I was expected to accommodate. After our father had married our mother and adopted Melissa when she was 3, before I was born, he had always been slightly more indulgent with her, perhaps compensating for the absence of her biological father. Our mother, meanwhile, had always identified more strongly with Melissa's emotional, expressive nature than with my more analytical approach. "I need to think about this," I said finally, buying myself time. "It's a significant financial decision, and I need to consider all aspects carefully." Melissa's face fell slightly. She had clearly expected me to agree immediately, as I often had throughout our lives when presented with family decisions that disproportionately benefited her. "There's really nothing to think about," she said, an edge creeping into her voice. "You want the house. Mom and Dad are offering it to you. The only condition is being supportive of family during a difficult time. Being supportive doesn't necessarily mean subsidizing your living situation indefinitely," I replied, the words coming out before I could temper them. The kitchen fell silent. My mother looked shocked at my directness, while my father studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Melissa's face flushed with anger. "Wow," she said after a moment. "So that's how you see this? As subsidizing me? Not as helping your niece and nephew maintain stability during their parents' divorce?" "I love Mia and Ethan," I said, referring to my 11 and 9-year-old niece and nephew. "And I want the best for them. But this house is worth nearly $600,000. What you're asking goes far beyond normal family support. I think we all need to step back and take a breath," my father suggested, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Let's enjoy our brunch and discuss this more when emotions aren't running high." My mother immediately seized the opportunity to change the subject, asking about my recent work conference in Seattle. The conversation shifted to safer topics, my father's upcoming retirement plans, community news, and my mother's garden club activities. Melissa remained unusually quiet, picking at her food and checking her phone frequently. As we cleared the dishes after the meal, my father pulled me aside while my mother and Melissa were loading the dishwasher. "I know this is a complicated situation," he said quietly, "and I want you to know that I see your perspective. Your mother and I will discuss this more and try to find a solution that's fair to everyone." I nodded, appreciating his acknowledgement, even while doubting any truly equitable solution would emerge. Too many years of watching similar scenarios unfold had taught me that fair to everyone typically meant whatever keeps Melissa happy. "Thanks, Dad," I said. "I just need some time to think about it." As I drove back to New Haven that afternoon, my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind replaying the brunch conversation on an endless loop. The familiar route along the Merritt Parkway barely registered as I processed what had happened. The assumptions, the double standards, the casual expectation that I would once again accommodate my sister's needs at significant personal cost. For years, I'd maintained a careful separation between my family life and my financial achievements. I'd downplayed my success, lived modestly despite my growing investments, and never corrected my family's perception of me as doing well enough, but not exceptionally. I'd wanted relationships that weren't influenced by money or power dynamics, had craved my family's respect for who I was rather than what I owned. But as I exited the parkway toward my neighborhood, a growing clarity emerged through my frustration. Perhaps I had been protecting the wrong things all along. By hiding my success to maintain peace, I had enabled the very patterns that continued to disadvantage me in family matters. Perhaps it was time for the truth to come out. Perhaps it was time they learned that the daughter they thought should subsidize her struggling sister had built something substantial entirely on her own. The solution emerged from an unexpected source. Later that evening, while organizing files in my home office, I came across a folder labeled Family Home Documentation. Inside were papers my father had given me for safekeeping 5 years earlier during a brief health scare. Among them, the original property deed, records of the home's purchase and improvements, and most significantly, a handwritten agreement my parents had seemingly forgotten. During a financial challenge 9 years ago, when my father's company had been downsizing, I had provided $35,000 to help them avoid taking on debt. The agreement we'd drafted stated that the money would be considered an investment in the family home, with the understanding that when they eventually sold, I would receive either repayment, with interest or a corresponding discount if I purchased the property. Additionally, I had meticulously documented every home improvement I had funded: the kitchen renovation, the HVAC replacement, the bathroom updates, and numerous smaller projects, totaling an additional $67,000 over the years. These hadn't been merely gifts as my mother had characterized them, but investments in a property I had always planned to purchase. Combined with the initial $35,000, which with accumulated interest was now worth approximately $48,000, I had already invested $115,000 in the house, nearly 20% of its current market value. My father had always been a careful record keeper, a trait I had inherited. Now those detailed records represented more than just organized paperwork. They were documentation of contributions that had gone unacknowledged and agreements that had been conveniently forgotten. As I reviewed the documents, a plan began to form. My sister had always relied on emotional appeals and my parents' protective instincts to get her way. Perhaps it was time to speak a language my financially minded father would understand clearly. The language of contracts, investments, and legal agreements. I created a comprehensive presentation outlining the original financial agreement with my parents, detailed records of every home improvement I had funded, current market analysis of the property value, a fair proposal for purchasing the house. That accounted for my previous investments, and a reasonable transition plan for Melissa that would give her time to find alternative housing while beginning to pay modest rent. The document was factual, unemotional, and undeniable, precisely the opposite of how family discussions typically proceeded in our household. For the first time, I felt a sense of confidence about addressing the situation directly. This wasn't about emotion or favoritism. It was about honoring agreements and recognizing contributions. I decided to wait until the following weekend to present my case, giving myself time to refine my approach and gather any additional documentation I might need. Throughout the week, Melissa sent several texts subtly probing whether I'd made a decision yet about the house. While my mother called twice to remind me how difficult the divorce had been on the children and how important stability was for them, I responded non-committally to both, neither agreeing to their terms nor revealing my plans. The waiting was difficult. I'd always been the family peacemaker, quick to accommodate others' needs even at personal cost. But something had shifted inside me, a recognition that true family support shouldn't consistently flow in only one direction. Saturday morning arrived with steady rain, droplets streaming down my windshield as I drove once again to my parents' house. I had my presentation in a professional portfolio, dressed in what I thought of as my meeting with difficult clients outfit. A tailored blazer over a simple blouse and trousers, minimal jewelry, and low heels. The formality was intentional, a physical reminder to myself that this was, in many ways, a business transaction as much as a family matter. When I arrived, I was surprised to find only my parents at home. My mother explained that Melissa had taken the children to their swimming lessons and would return later. The absence of my sister felt like an unexpected advantage, an opportunity to speak directly to my parents without her emotional influence. "I've given the house situation a lot of thought," I said once we were settled in the living room, the portfolio resting on my lap. "And I've prepared something I'd like you both to review." My mother looked confused by my formal tone, while my father leaned forward with interest. I opened the portfolio and removed the original handwritten agreement, passing it to him first. "Do you remember this?" I asked quietly. He took the paper, recognition dawning in his eyes as he read. "The money you provided during the Westfield downsizing," he said, referring to his former company. Of course I remember. The week that followed was one of the strangest of my life. After presenting my documentation to my parents, I had expected an immediate confrontation with Melissa, accusations of betrayal, perhaps even an ultimatum from my parents to maintain family peace. Instead, there was silence. My mother's daily check-in texts stopped. My father, who typically sent brief but regular emails with interesting articles or updates about projects around the house, went quiet. Most surprisingly, Melissa, who would usually bombard me with messages when she sensed any shift in family dynamics that might affect her, sent nothing. The silence was more unsettling than any confrontation would have been. I found myself checking my phone compulsively during meetings, glancing at my email between project reviews, feeling a constant low-grade anxiety about what was happening in my absence. Had my parents simply dismissed my documentation? Were they closing ranks with Melissa, formulating a united front against my boundaries? Or was something else entirely occurring? Something I couldn't anticipate because it fell outside our established patterns? On Thursday evening, as I was reviewing zoning proposals in my apartment, my phone rang with my father's number. I answered immediately, my heart accelerating with anticipation. "Olivia," he said, his voice sounding different than I'd expected. Not defensive or confrontational, but strangely subdued. "Your mother and I have spent the past few days reviewing everything you shared with us. We've also been doing some soul-searching about family patterns." I waited, uncertain where this was heading. "We'd like to meet with you," he continued. "Not at the house, somewhere neutral. There's a lot we need to discuss." "When?" I asked, trying to gauge the urgency of their request. "This weekend, if you can make it. Saturday morning. There's a small cafe called Pembroke's near the town library. Does 10 a.m. work for you?" "Yes," I replied. "Will Melissa be there?" There was a slight pause. "No. This is a conversation your mother and I need to have with you first. Just us." This deviation from the usual family protocol, where Melissa was almost always present for significant conversations, her reactions and needs centered and accommodated, felt meaningful in ways I couldn't quite articulate. "I'll be there," I said. As I hung up, I noticed my hands were trembling slightly. Something fundamental was shifting, though whether toward reconciliation or deeper rupture remained unclear. I arrived at Pembroke's 15 minutes early on Saturday, choosing a quiet corner table with good sightlines to the door. The cafe was tastefully appointed but unpretentious, with local artwork on exposed brick walls and the gentle hum of morning conversations creating a soothing backdrop. I ordered a pot of tea, needing something to do with my hands while I waited. My parents arrived precisely at 10, looking both familiar and somehow different. My mother's usual perfect composure seemed slightly frayed, her makeup minimal, her typically meticulous hair simply pulled back. My father, always the picture of calm authority, appeared to have aged in the week since I'd last seen him, new lines visible around his eyes. After ordering coffee, my father opened a leather portfolio similar to the one I'd presented my documentation in, a visual echo that struck me as deliberate. "We owe you an apology," he began without preamble, his directness catching me off guard. "Several apologies, actually." My mother reached across the table, covering my hand with hers, a gesture so uncharacteristic that I nearly pulled away in surprise. "We've spent this week reviewing not just your financial records," she said, "but our family dynamics over the past 30 years. It's been enlightening and painful. What we've realized," my father continued, "is that we've been engaging in patterns of favoritism and inequity that have done a disservice to both our daughters, though in very different ways." I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement or response might disrupt this unexpected acknowledgement of truths I had felt, but never expected to hear voiced by either of my parents. My father removed a document from his portfolio, a spreadsheet I immediately recognized as one I had created, detailing my investments in the family home. But it had been expanded, with new columns and notes in my father's precise handwriting. "You documented your financial contributions meticulously," he said. "After reviewing them, I became curious about the larger pattern of resource distribution in our family, so I did some analysis of my own." He slid the document toward me. The spreadsheet now included every significant financial support my parents had provided to both daughters over the past decade: college tuition, graduate school for Melissa, help with down payments on my first small condo versus assistance, with Melissa's much larger first home, support during career transitions, gifts, loans that were later forgiven. The disparities were stark, far more substantial than even I had realized. "The numbers tell a story I'm not proud of," my father said quietly. "One I honestly didn't see until it was laid out this way." My mother squeezed my hand. "It's not just financial, Olivia. We've consistently expected more independence and resilience from you while sheltering Melissa from consequences. We've celebrated her minor achievements while taking your significant ones for granted. We've accommodated her needs and preferences while asking you to adjust yours." The simple acknowledgement of dynamics I had felt but never expected to be recognized left me momentarily speechless. I had come prepared for negotiation, for having to defend my boundaries and assertions. I had not anticipated this straightforward acknowledgement of patterns too long unaddressed. "Why now?" I finally managed. "What changed?" My parents exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them before my father responded. "Concrete evidence is powerful," he said, tapping the spreadsheet. "Your documentation forced us to confront realities we'd been avoiding. But beyond that," he hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I had a health scare 3 years ago. Nothing serious as it turned out, but it made me start thinking about legacy, about what kind of father I've been, and what kind of relationship I want with my daughters moving forward." My mother nodded. "And I've been in therapy for the past year," she admitted, surprising me completely. My mother had always dismissed therapy as unnecessary for people with proper self-control. "I started going for anxiety, but it's evolved into examining family of origin patterns that I've unconsciously perpetuated. We've been having difficult conversations for months about changes we need to make," my father added. "Your presentation of the property documentation was a catalyst that accelerated a process already underway. This context shifted my understanding of their response entirely." It wasn't just about the house or the financial agreements. It was part of a larger reckoning they had already begun. "What happens now?" I asked, uncertain where this new territory of acknowledgement might lead us. "We accept your proposal regarding the house," my father said firmly, "with perhaps a few minor adjustments to the transition timeline for Melissa, if you're amenable. But more importantly, we want to establish new patterns of fairness and accountability in our family relationships." My mother nodded. "We've already had some difficult conversations with your sister about these issues. She's resistant, as you might expect, but we're holding firm on the need for change." The mention of Melissa brought me back to practical concerns. How is she taking the news about the house purchase? My parents exchanged another glance, this one more weighted with tension. "Not well initially," my father admitted. "There was quite a scene when we first presented the documentation and explained our decision to honor your proposal. She accused us of betrayal," my mother added, a hint of her old defensiveness briefly surfacing before she visibly recalibrated. "But that's not your responsibility to manage, Olivia. It's ours. We created these patterns, and it's on us to establish new ones." "She's been staying with a friend since Wednesday," my father explained. "She needed space to process, which is understandable. But we've made it clear that the decisions about the house are final, and that broader changes in family dynamics are necessary regardless of her comfort with them." The idea of my parents standing firm against Melissa's emotional reactions was so contrary to established family patterns that I found myself momentarily skeptical. And if she refuses to accept these changes? If she escalates? My father's expression turned resolute. Then she faces natural consequences for the first time in her adult life. "We love her deeply, Olivia, but we're beginning to understand that our pattern of rescuing her from discomfort has undermined her development of resilience and responsibility. And done you a profound disservice in the process," my mother added, quietly, "by expecting you to consistently accommodate while demanding little accountability from your sister." The acknowledgement felt like rain after drought, nourishing a parched landscape of unrecognized truth I had carried for decades. Yet I remained cautious, knowing that established patterns don't transform overnight. "I appreciate everything you're saying," I said carefully, "but these dynamics have been in place for our entire lives. Changing them will take more than good intentions." "You're absolutely right," my father agreed. "That's why we've drafted this." He removed another document from his portfolio, a formal family agreement outlining principles of fairness, transparency, and mutual respect for future interactions. It included specific commitments, equal consideration of both daughters' needs and contributions, financial transparency, consistent accountability for all family members, respect for individual boundaries and autonomy. "We'd like this to be a living document," my mother explained. "Something we can all refer to, modify as needed, and use to check ourselves when we fall back into old patterns." "And we will fall back," my father acknowledged with surprising self-awareness. "Habits of decades don't change overnight, but having explicit agreements gives us all permission to call out backsliding when it occurs." As I reviewed the document, I felt an unexpected emotion rising, not just validation or vindication, but a tentative hope. Perhaps genuine change was possible, not despite but because of the difficult truths I had finally brought into the light. "What about Melissa?" I asked again, returning to the most immediate practical concern. "Even with your support, the transition regarding the house will be challenging." "We've outlined a support plan," my father said, producing yet another document. "Financial counseling for her, which we've already arranged and will fund. Assistance in finding suitable housing within her actual budget. Regular sessions with a family therapist for all of us to navigate the transition. But no more enabling," my mother added firmly. No more rescuing her from natural consequences at your expense. We spent the next hour discussing details. The timeline for the property transfer, the graduated rent increase schedule for Melissa, maintenance responsibilities during the transition period. Throughout the conversation, my parents maintained an approach I had rarely experienced from them, treating me as an equal party in significant decisions, acknowledging my concerns as valid, considering my needs as worthy of accommodation, as my sisters had always been. As we prepared to leave, my father asked a question that caught me off guard with its directness and vulnerability. "Do you think you can forgive us, Olivia? For the years of inequity, the times we failed to see you clearly or value your contributions fairly?" The question touched something deep within me, a longing for reconciliation I hadn't fully acknowledged to myself. "I think forgiveness is a process," I replied honestly. "One that will unfold alongside these new patterns we're establishing. I'm willing to move forward with hope, if that's enough for now." He nodded, accepting this partial answer with respect for its boundaries. "It's more than enough. Thank you for your grace." My mother embraced me before we parted, whispering, "I'm so proud of the woman you've become, not despite our failures, but somehow in the midst of them. Thank you for having the courage to show us difficult truths." I drove back to New Haven that afternoon with a strange mixture of emotions, cautious optimism about the new agreements, lingering wariness born of years of disappointment, and beneath it all, a quiet validation that felt like ground solidifying beneath my feet after years of shifting sand. The real test came 3 days later, when Melissa finally reached out with a text requesting we meet. I suggested a quiet restaurant halfway between our locations, neutral territory for what I anticipated would be a difficult conversation. She was waiting when I arrived, seated at a corner table with her back to the wall, a defensive posture I recognized from childhood confrontations. What struck me immediately was how different she looked, not just subdued or angry as I had expected, but somehow diminished, as though the scaffolding of special treatment that had supported her self-image had been partially dismantled. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as I sat down, her usual dramatic flair notably absent. "Of course," I replied, studying her carefully. "How are you doing with everything?" She gave a small, humorless laugh. "How do you think? My entire world just collapsed. The safety net I've been counting on disappeared overnight." "Not overnight," I pointed out gently. "This has been building for years. The documentation just made it impossible to ignore any longer." She nodded reluctantly. "That's what Dad keeps saying too, that this isn't about the house so much as patterns that should have been addressed decades ago." "He's not wrong." "I know," she admitted, surprising me with this concession. "That's partly why I wanted to see you. I've been doing a lot of thinking since their intervention." She pulled a notebook from her bag, opening it to reveal pages of handwritten notes. "Dad suggested I try to see things from your perspective, to imagine how our family dynamics have felt from your position." It was uncomfortable. The admission, devoid of her usual defensiveness, felt significant. Uncomfortable how? Because when I really thought about it, really tried to see things objectively, I couldn't avoid recognizing patterns I've benefited from while you've consistently drawn the short straw. She glanced down at her notes. "Financial support that was given freely to me but made contingent for you. Accommodation of my needs and preferences while yours were treated as secondary. Celebration of my achievements while yours were taken for granted." The straightforward acknowledgement of dynamics I had felt but never expected to hear Melissa recognize left me momentarily speechless. "I'm not saying I'm happy about the changes," she continued when I didn't immediately respond. "I'm not. They're terrifying, honestly. I don't know how to function without the safety net I've always had, but I can't deny the fundamental unfairness once it's been pointed out so clearly." I studied her face, looking for signs of the manipulation that had characterized so many of our interactions throughout our lives. Instead, I saw something I'd rarely witnessed in my sister: genuine vulnerability unprotected by her usual armor of dramatic flourish or strategic emotion. "What does this mean for us?" I asked carefully. "For you and me, going forward?" She took a sip of water, her hand trembling slightly. "I don't know exactly. I've never had to navigate a relationship with you as equals, with mutual respect and boundaries." She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "That probably sounds terrible, but it's honest." "Honesty is a good place to start," I offered. "Then, honestly, I'm scared," she admitted. "Not just about the practical aspects, finding affordable housing, adjusting my lifestyle to match my actual income, but about who I am without the special treatment I've always received, about what our relationship looks like without me at the center." The raw acknowledgement of dynamics that had shaped our entire lives felt like crossing into unfamiliar territory where authentic connection might actually be possible. "I can understand that fear," I said. "Change is difficult, especially when it involves core aspects of identity and relationship." She studied me for a moment. "How are you not furious with me? With all of us? Years of being overlooked, your contributions minimized, your needs considered secondary. I would be burning with resentment." It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly since my parents' unexpected acknowledgement of long-standing patterns. "I've had moments of anger," I admitted, "but mostly I feel validated. There's something profoundly healing about having truths you've felt for decades finally recognized and named." Melissa nodded slowly. "Dad showed me the expanded financial spreadsheet he created, the one tracking all the support they've given each of us over the years. The disparities were—" She trailed off, then continued more quietly. "They were shocking, even to me, and I was the beneficiary. It wasn't just about money," I pointed out. "It was about whose needs were centered, whose boundaries were respected, whose achievements were celebrated." "I know," she acknowledged. "That's actually harder for me to face than the financial imbalance. Money is concrete. I can calculate repayment or adjustment. But the emotional patterns, the implicit hierarchies we established, those feel more fundamental, more damaging." Her insight surprised me. Melissa had never been one for deep introspection or acknowledgement of interpersonal dynamics beyond how they affected her directly. Whatever process she'd undergone in the days since our parents' intervention had clearly prompted unusual self-reflection. "So what happens now?" I asked, returning to practical matters. "With the house transition, with our relationship going forward?" She straightened her shoulders slightly, as though preparing to shoulder an unaccustomed weight. "I accept your purchase proposal and the graduated rent increase. It's more than fair. I'll work with the financial counselor Dad arranged to develop a realistic budget and housing search plan. And—" She hesitated, then continued with visible effort. "And I'd like to work on developing a healthier relationship with you. One where I don't expect automatic accommodation or special treatment. One where we might actually enjoy each other's company without the underlying tensions of inequity." The proposal, offered without dramatic flourish or manipulative emotion, felt like the most genuine connection we'd shared in years, perhaps ever. "I'd like that too," I said simply. As we prepared to leave, Melissa surprised me one final time. "There's something I need to say explicitly," she said, meeting my eyes directly. "I'm sorry, Olivia. For a lifetime of taking without acknowledging, of expecting accommodation without reciprocity, of treating my needs and preferences as inherently more important than yours. You deserved better from all of us, but especially from me as your sister." The straightforward apology, devoid of qualifications or subtle redirections of responsibility, felt like a foundation upon which something new might actually be built. "Thank you," I said, unexpectedly moved. That means a great deal to me. The following weeks brought both steady progress and inevitable challenges as our family attempted to establish new patterns of interaction. My parents maintained their commitment to more equitable treatment, though occasional lapses occurred, usually in moments of stress or when confronted with particularly powerful emotional displays from Melissa. The difference was their willingness to acknowledge these lapses when pointed out, rather than becoming defensive or dismissive. Melissa's journey was more unpredictable, as one might expect given the fundamental shifts required in her self-concept and approach to relationships. Her initial determination to accept changes with grace gave way to periods of resentment, occasional attempts to reestablish old dynamics, and moments of genuine anger at what she perceived as abandonment by our parents. Yet even within this turbulence, I noticed a gradual trend toward greater self-awareness and accountability. The scheduled family therapy sessions, which began awkwardly but gradually developed into meaningful conversations, provided structured space to address backsliding and reinforce new patterns. Our therapist, Dr. Winters, had a particular talent for noting subtle reemergences of entrenched dynamics. My tendency to over-accommodate despite my new boundaries, my parents' instinctive centering of Melissa's emotional reactions, Melissa's strategic deployment of vulnerability to gain advantage. Family systems don't transform overnight, Dr. Winters reminded us during a particularly difficult session following a heated argument about Melissa's housing search. You're disrupting patterns established over decades. Regression is inevitable, and actually a normal part of the change process. My father, always the analyst, had taken to maintaining a journal documenting our progress, noting successful implementations of our new agreements, instances of backsliding, and strategies that seemed particularly effective in maintaining healthier dynamics. During one of our individual coffee meetings, he shared some of his observations. "What I've noticed," he said, reviewing his meticulous notes, "is that transitions are particularly vulnerable points. When we're stressed, tired, or facing significant decisions, we all tend to revert to established patterns. You becoming quiet and accommodating, Melissa escalating emotional displays, your mother and I centering her reactions." I nodded, recognizing the accuracy of his assessment. "So, how do we address that vulnerability?" "Awareness is the first step," he replied, "naming the pattern when we see it emerging, before it fully takes hold. But beyond that, I think we need explicit protocols for handling high-stress situations. Agreed-upon approaches that create enough structure to prevent automatic reversion to old dynamics." This systematic approach to family healing reflected my father's professional problem-solving orientation, but it also demonstrated a commitment to change that went beyond mere good intentions. He was applying the same analytical rigor to our family patterns that he had employed throughout his successful career, treating the issue with the seriousness it deserved. By the 3-month mark of our agreement, tangible progress was evident on multiple fronts. The property transfer was proceeding smoothly, with preliminary paperwork completed and a closing date scheduled. Melissa had found a 2-bedroom apartment within her actual budget in a neighborhood that would allow her children to remain in their current school district. And perhaps most significantly, our family interactions had developed a new quality of authenticity and mutual respect that, while imperfect, represented genuine evolution. One Saturday morning, as I supervised some minor repairs to what would soon be officially my home, Melissa stopped by unexpectedly with coffee and pastries from our favorite local bakery. "Thought you might need sustenance," she said, setting the offerings on the kitchen counter. "The kids are with their dad this weekend, and I was in the neighborhood looking at furniture for the new place." I accepted the coffee gratefully, noting the small but significant gesture in our evolving relationship. Melissa initiating contact without an underlying agenda, bringing something for my benefit rather than arriving with needs to be accommodated. "How's the apartment preparation going?" I asked as we settled at the kitchen table. "Better than expected, actually," she replied. "The financial counseling has been..." illuminating. Turns out I can actually afford a decent life if I make realistic choices based on my actual income rather than the lifestyle I wish I had. She pulled out her phone, showing me photos of modest but attractive furniture she was considering. "Nothing like I would have chosen before," she admitted with a small laugh. "But honestly, I'm finding there's something liberating about living within actual means, rather than constant financial anxiety masked by occasional extravagant purchases." As we discussed practical aspects of her upcoming move, I noticed subtle but meaningful shifts in her approach, a new willingness to accept limitation without resentment, an ability to find satisfaction in choices that were sustainable rather than impressive, a capacity for self-deprecating humor about her previous patterns. "You know what's weird?" she said as we finished our coffee. "I thought losing the safety net would feel like punishment or deprivation. And sometimes it does, I won't lie. But other times, it feels like, I don't know, like finally being treated as a capable adult rather than a perpetual child who needs protection from consequences." The insight suggested a depth of self-reflection I hadn't previously associated with my sister. "That makes sense," I offered. "There's dignity in handling your own challenges even when it's difficult." She nodded, then asked a question that caught me off guard with its directness. "Do you think you'll ever fully trust me, Olivia? After everything? The years of imbalance, the taking for granted, the times I've prioritized my needs over yours without a second thought?" The question deserved an honest answer. "I think trust is rebuilt gradually," I said carefully. "Through consistent action over time rather than dramatic declarations of change. I'm seeing that consistency beginning and it matters. I'm cautiously optimistic." "Cautiously optimistic," she repeated with a small smile. "That's fair. More than fair, probably." As she prepared to leave, she paused in the doorway. No, I was so angry when Mom and Dad first told me about your documentation and the property agreement. I felt betrayed, blindsided. But now, looking back, I can see it was actually necessary. A wake-up call I wouldn't have heard any other way. The acknowledgement, offered without prompting or obvious strategic purpose, suggested genuine growth rather than calculated impression management. "Sometimes difficult truths are the most important ones to face," I replied. "Even when they hurt like hell," she added with a rueful smile. The day of the property closing arrived with surprising emotional complexity. What should have been a straightforward legal transaction felt weighted with symbolic significance. The formal recognition of contributions long minimized, the establishment of boundaries long ignored, the balancing of scales long tilted. My parents met me at the law office, both dressed with uncharacteristic formality for what was, in essence, a family matter. As we reviewed the final documents, my father placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "Not just for your financial acumen or your meticulous documentation, but for having the courage to disrupt patterns that weren't serving any of us well, even when doing so was uncomfortable." My mother, who had been more tentative in addressing our family dynamics directly, added her own acknowledgement. "You've always been our rock," she said, her voice carrying unusual emotion. "The one we counted on without properly recognizing or appreciating. I'm sorry it took concrete evidence to make us see what should have been obvious all along." As the paperwork was processed, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and melancholy. Satisfaction at having my contributions finally recognized and valued, sadness for the years spent without that recognition, and a quiet uncertainty about how these shifting dynamics would continue to evolve over time. The property deed that passed into my possession that day represented more than just legal ownership of a house. It had become a catalyst for transformation, a tangible symbol of truths brought to light and patterns disrupted after decades of unquestioned acceptance. That evening, after the closing was complete, I invited my parents and sister for a simple, dinner in what was now officially my home. The gathering was quieter than our usual family events, tinged with the awareness of significant transition. As we sat around the table where so many family dynamics had played out over the years, my father raised his glass in an impromptu toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes meeting mine with genuine warmth. "And to the courage it takes to challenge patterns we've outgrown, even when, especially when, doing so disrupts comfortable equilibrium." My mother added her glass to the toast. "To recognition long overdue. May we continue to see each other clearly and honor each other's truths." Melissa hesitated, then raised her water glass. Another change. She had cut back on wine as part of her financial restructuring. "To boundaries," she said, with a self-awareness that still occasionally surprised me. "And to the sister who finally enforced them when the rest of us couldn't or wouldn't recognize their necessity." The acknowledgements, offered without prompting, or obvious reluctance, felt like another step in our family's gradual transformation. Not the dramatic reconciliation of movie-land family dramas, but the steady, imperfect work of honest recognition and changed behavior. After dinner, as we lingered over coffee in the living room, my father presented me with a small wrapped package. "We wanted to mark this transition properly," he explained. Inside was a beautifully framed copy of the original property deed alongside a handwritten note. "To Olivia, who taught us that sometimes the most valuable property isn't the house itself, but the courage to claim your rightful place within its walls and within our hearts. With love and newfound respect, Mom and Dad." The gesture, meaningful in its recognition of both practical contribution and emotional impact, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I managed, touched by the explicit acknowledgement of truths so long unspoken. Melissa approached next, offering her own small package. Inside was a key ring bearing a miniature version of the property deed encased in clear acrylic. "To remind us both," she explained, "that healthy relationships require mutual respect and recognition, not just comfortable patterns of give and take." As they prepared to leave, my mother embraced me with unusual fierceness. "I'm so proud of the woman you've become," she whispered. "Not despite our failures, but somehow in the midst of them. Thank you for having the courage to show us difficult truths when it would have been easier to maintain the status quo." Later that night, alone in my newly official home, I sat in the quiet living room reflecting on the journey of the past months. The property deed that had catalyzed our family's transformation now hung framed in my home office, a reminder not just of legal ownership, but of the power of bringing hidden truths into the light. The path forward wouldn't be perfect. Old patterns would resurface, especially during times of stress or transition. My parents would occasionally slip into their habitual centering of Melissa's needs. Melissa would sometimes attempt to reestablish dynamics of special treatment, and I would find myself tempted to accommodate rather than maintain clear boundaries. Change is rarely linear, particularly when disrupting systems established over decades. Yet beneath these inevitable fluctuations ran a current of fundamental transformation, the recognition of contributions long minimized, the establishment of boundaries long ignored, the development of relationships based on mutual respect rather than entrenched patterns of giving and taking. 2 months after the property closing, as summer transitioned into early fall, Melissa moved into her new apartment. The process was not without challenges, moments of resentment at perceived downgrades in lifestyle, occasional attempts to delay or modify the agreed-upon timeline, brief re-emergences of old patterns of emotional escalation to gain accommodation. Yet through these expected turbulences, she maintained a core commitment to the new direction, working with her financial counselor to align her lifestyle with her actual resources rather than her previous expectations. I helped her move on a crisp Saturday morning, the two of us navigating furniture placement and unpacking boxes with a collaborative spirit that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. As we arranged her living room, creating a space that was modest but comfortable and welcoming, she paused in her unpacking. "You know what's strange?" she said, straightening up from a box of books. "I thought this would feel like failure. Downsizing, living within actual means, accepting limitations, and sometimes it does ping that old shame. But mostly it feels, I don't know, authentic? Like I'm finally living in reality instead of an unsustainable fiction." The insight suggested genuine growth rather than strategic adaptation to temporary constraints. "There's freedom in that authenticity," I offered. She nodded, then asked a question that surprised me with its vulnerability. "Do you think we could have gotten here any other way? Without the confrontation over the house, without the documentation and the proposal and all of it?" I considered this carefully, wanting to offer an honest assessment rather than comfortable reassurance. "Probably not," I admitted. Systems resist change, especially when they're functioning effectively for some members, even at others' expense. It usually takes a significant disruption to catalyze transformation. Like showing up with irrefutable documentation of years of unacknowledged contribution and boundary violation, she suggested with a rueful smile. "Something like that," I agreed, returning her smile. As we continued unpacking, I noticed small but meaningful signs of her evolving approach to life. Financial planning documents posted on her refrigerator, a budget tracking app prominent on her phone home screen, modest but thoughtful choices in furnishings and decor that reflected realistic resources rather than aspirational spending. "The kids are adjusting better than I expected," she mentioned as we arranged family photos on a bookshelf. "I was so worried about how they'd handle the transition, the downsizing, the change in lifestyle expectations, but they seem almost relieved? Like maybe the constant undercurrent of financial stress and pretense was affecting them more than I realized." This recognition of impact beyond her immediate experience represented significant growth in Melissa's typically self-centered worldview. "Children are perceptive," I said. "They pick up on emotional currents even when we think we're shielding them." "You've always been good with them," she observed. "Patient, present, interested in who they actually are rather than who you want them to be. That's something I'm trying to learn from you, to see them clearly rather than as extensions or reflections of myself." The acknowledgement, offered without obvious strategic purpose, suggested genuine reflection rather than calculated impression management. "They're amazing kids," I said simply. "I've always enjoyed getting to know them as their own unique people." As evening approached and the apartment took shape around us, Melissa ordered takeout from a modestly priced local restaurant, another small but notable shift from her previous insistence on premium options regardless of budget constraints. "I've been thinking about something Dr. Winters said in our last family session," she mentioned as we sat down to eat, "about how the healthiest family systems allow for individual autonomy within connected relationships, rather than enforcing either enmeshment or disconnection." I nodded, recalling the conversation. "Finding that balance is challenging," I acknowledged, "especially when established patterns have leaned heavily toward one extreme or the other." "We were definitely on the enmeshment end of the spectrum," Melissa observed, "with patterns of accommodation and caretaking that created dependencies rather than healthy interdependence. I'm trying to figure out what healthy connection looks like without those old dynamics." "Me too," I admitted. "It's new territory for all of us." As I prepared to leave her newly established home, Melissa surprised me with a hug that felt different from our usual perfunctory embraces, genuine rather than performative, connecting rather than strategic. "Thank you," she said simply. Not just for helping with the move, but for disrupting patterns that weren't serving any of us well, even when doing so was uncomfortable and faced resistance. The acknowledgement, freely offered without external prompting or obvious advantage to be gained, felt like confirmation of genuine change rather than temporary accommodation to altered circumstances. "We're figuring it out together," I replied, returning her embrace. Driving home that evening to my officially owned house, I reflected on the journey of the past months. The property deed that had initiated our family's transformation had been just the beginning, the visible tip of an iceberg of unacknowledged patterns and unbalanced dynamics that had shaped our interactions for decades. Bringing those hidden currents to the surface hadn't been comfortable or easy for any of us. There had been resistance, resentment, moments of regression to established roles and comfortable scripts. There would continue to be challenges as we navigated this new territory of mutual respect and clear boundaries. Yet, beneath the inevitable fluctuations ran a current of fundamental change. The recognition of contributions long minimized, the establishment of boundaries long ignored, the development of relationships based on authentic connection rather than entrenched patterns of accommodation and expectation. Sometimes the quietest person in the room really is the one holding all the cards, and sometimes it takes showing those cards to change the game entirely. As she prepared to leave, Melissa paused in the doorway. "You know, I was so angry when Mom and Dad first told me about your documentation and the property agreement. I felt betrayed, blindsided. But now, looking back, I can see it was actually necessary. A wake-up call I wouldn't have heard any other way." The acknowledgement, offered without prompting or obvious strategic purpose, suggested genuine growth rather than calculated impression management. "Sometimes difficult truths are the most important ones to face," I replied. "Even when they hurt like hell," she added with a rueful smile. The day of the property closing arrived with surprising emotional complexity. What should have been a straightforward legal transaction felt weighted with symbolic significance. The formal recognition of contributions long minimized, the establishment of boundaries long ignored, the balancing of scales long tilted. My parents met me at the law office, both dressed with uncharacteristic formality for what was, in essence, a family matter. As we reviewed the final documents, my father placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "Not just for your financial acumen or your meticulous documentation, but for having the courage to disrupt patterns that weren't serving any of us well, even when doing so was uncomfortable." My mother, who had been more tentative in addressing our family dynamics directly, added her own acknowledgement. "You've always been our rock," she said, her voice carrying unusual emotion. "The one we counted on without properly recognizing or appreciating. I'm sorry it took concrete evidence to make us see what should have been obvious all along." As the paperwork was processed, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and melancholy, satisfaction at having my contributions finally recognized and valued, sadness for the years spent without that recognition, and a quiet uncertainty about how these shifting dynamics would continue to evolve over time. The property deed that passed into my possession that day represented more than just legal ownership of a house. It had become a catalyst for transformation, a tangible symbol of truths brought to light and patterns disrupted after decades of unquestioned acceptance. That evening, after the closing was complete, I invited my parents and sister for a simple dinner in what was now officially my home. The gathering was quieter than our usual family events, tinged with the awareness of significant transition. As we sat around the table where so many family dynamics had played out over the years, my father raised his glass in an impromptu toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes meeting mine with genuine warmth. "And to the courage it takes to challenge patterns we've outgrown, even when, especially when, doing so disrupts comfortable equilibrium." My mother added her glass to the toast. "To recognition long overdue. May we continue to see each other clearly and honor each other's truths." Melissa hesitated, then raised her water glass, another change. She had cut back on wine as part of her financial restructuring. "To boundaries," she said, with a self-awareness that still occasionally surprised me. and to the sister who finally enforced them when the rest of us couldn't or wouldn't recognize their necessity. The acknowledgements, offered without prompting, or obvious reluctance, felt like another step in our family's gradual transformation, not the dramatic reconciliation of movie-land family dramas, but the steady, imperfect work of honest recognition and changed behavior. After dinner, as we lingered over coffee in the living room, my father presented me with a small wrapped package. "We wanted to mark this transition properly," he explained. Inside was a beautifully framed copy of the original property deed, alongside a handwritten note. "To Olivia, who taught us that sometimes the most valuable property isn't the house itself, but the courage to claim your rightful place within its walls and within our hearts. With love and newfound respect, Mom and Dad." The gesture, meaningful in its recognition of both practical contribution and emotional impact, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I managed, touched by the explicit acknowledgement of truth so long unspoken. Melissa approached next, offering her own small package. Inside was a key ring bearing a miniature version of the property deed encased in clear acrylic. "To remind us both," she explained, "that healthy relationships require mutual respect and recognition, not just comfortable patterns of give and take." As they prepared to leave, my mother embraced me with unusual fierceness. "I'm so proud of the woman you've become," she whispered. "Not despite our failures, but somehow in the midst of them. Thank you for having the courage to show us difficult truths when it would have been easier to maintain the status quo." The weeks following the property closing brought a new rhythm to our family interactions. With the formal transfer complete, and Melissa's move to her apartment scheduled for the following month, we entered a transition period that tested our commitment to the new patterns we were establishing. True to Dr. Winter's predictions, stress brought occasional reemergence of entrenched dynamics. My mother's instinctive centering of Melissa's emotional reactions flared during discussions about dividing family heirlooms and furniture. My father's tendency to process silently rather than address tensions directly reappeared during complex logistical planning. Melissa's strategic deployment of vulnerability to gain advantage emerged in subtle ways during conversations about move-in assistance and childcare arrangements. Yet, unlike in the past, these lapses were now generally recognized, sometimes in the moment and sometimes upon reflection. The family agreement my father had drafted, which hung framed in each of our homes, provided a touchstone for acknowledging backsliding without accusation or defensiveness. "I think I'm watching pattern 3 emerge," my father would note during particularly tense conversations, referring to his categorization of our most common, dysfunctional interactions. This naming of patterns, clinical rather than accusatory, created space for reorientation without escalation. Dr. Winters had introduced another helpful practice: regular ecosystem checks, where each family member assessed the current state of our relationships and interactions. These structured reflections, shared during therapy sessions, provided accountability while acknowledging that transformation is rarely linear. "What I'm noticing," I shared during one such session as Melissa's move approached, "is that I'm still reflexively anticipating accommodation requests and preparing to meet them before they're even expressed. And I'm still expecting them to be met," Melissa acknowledged with surprising candor, "even when I don't explicitly ask. There's this assumption deep in my nervous system that everyone will reorganize around my needs, and I feel unreasonably frustrated when that doesn't happen." This mutual recognition of ingrained patterns, shared without blame or defensiveness, represented significant growth in our communication. From the strategic positioning and emotional manipulation that had characterized past interactions to a more authentic, if occasionally uncomfortable, honesty. Family systems develop over decades, Dr. Winters reminded us. The neural pathways that support established patterns are deeply encoded. Expecting them to be completely rewired in a few months would be unrealistic. What matters is the direction of movement and the commitment to continue even through inevitable setbacks. One such setback occurred the weekend before Melissa's scheduled move. She called me on Friday evening, her voice carrying the particular tone of controlled distress that had historically preceded requests for accommodation or assistance. "The moving company just canceled," she said without preamble. "Something about a scheduling error. They can't reschedule until the following weekend, but I need to be out of the house by Wednesday when the rent increase takes effect." In the past, this situation would have followed a predictable script. Melissa's crisis would become everyone's emergency, with my parents mobilizing resources, financial and logistical, and me expected to adjust my plans to assist. I would have automatically rearranged my schedule, perhaps canceling important commitments to accommodate the sudden need. But something had shifted in our dynamic. Instead of immediately offering solutions or adjusting my plans, I paused, creating space for Melissa to own her challenge. "That's frustrating," I acknowledged. "What options are you considering?" The slight silence that followed suggested she had expected a different response, perhaps an immediate offer to handle the situation for her. "Well," she said after a moment, "I've started calling other moving companies to check availability, and I'm looking into renting a U-Haul as a backup plan, though I'm not sure how I'd manage the heavy furniture." "Those sound like reasonable approaches," I affirmed. "Let me know what you decide, and if there's specific help you'd like to request once you have a plan." This response, supportive but not assuming responsibility, represented a subtle but significant boundary that would have been unthinkable in our previous dynamics. Rather than automatically reorganizing around Melissa's crisis, I was maintaining appropriate separation while remaining available for clearly defined assistance if requested. To my surprise, Melissa handled the situation with unexpected resourcefulness. She secured another moving company at a slightly higher rate, negotiated a payment plan rather than asking our parents for the difference, and organized her friends to help with the smaller items to reduce the overall moving time and cost. "I would have handled this very differently a few months ago," she admitted when we spoke after the new arrangements were confirmed. "I would have expected everyone to drop everything and solve it for me, probably with a healthy dose of guilt-tripping thrown in." "What changed?" I asked, genuinely curious about her internal process. She considered this carefully. "Partly the financial counseling, honestly. Learning to distinguish between actual emergencies and uncomfortable situations I'd prefer to avoid handling. And partly, I don't know, a growing awareness that my problems don't actually have to become everyone else's responsibility." The insight suggested genuine growth rather than strategic adaptation to temporary constraints. "That's significant," I observed. "How does it feel?" "Mixed," she acknowledged with refreshing honesty. "There's an uncomfortable vulnerability in handling things myself without the safety net I'm used to. But there's also a kind of dignity, a self-respect that comes from addressing my own challenges." This evolution in Melissa's approach to obstacles represented perhaps the most meaningful shift in our family system. From reflexive dependence and accommodation to a more balanced interdependence where support was requested specifically rather than assumed as entitlement. The actual move, when it occurred the following weekend, unfolded with surprisingly little drama. My parents and I assisted as requested, following Melissa's lead rather than taking over or imposing our own approaches. The children adapted to the transition with unexpected resilience, seemingly energized by their mother's positive framing of the change as an adventure rather than a downsizing or loss. As we unpacked the last boxes in her new apartment, Melissa surveyed the space with a complex mixture of emotions playing across her face. Pride in what she had accomplished, lingering anxiety about the changes ahead, and a quiet determination that hadn't been characteristic of her approach to challenges in the past. "It's smaller than what I'm used to," she acknowledged, "but it's mine in a way the family house never really was. I'm paying for it myself, decorating it according to my actual taste rather than some image I'm trying to project, making realistic choices that won't keep me awake with financial anxiety at night. The self-awareness in this reflection suggested genuine growth rather than strategic impression management. "There's freedom in that authenticity," I offered. She nodded, then surprised me with an unexpected question. "Do you think I would have gotten here without the confrontation over the property deed? Without being forced to face patterns I probably would have continued indefinitely if permitted?" I considered this carefully, wanting to offer an honest assessment rather than diplomatic reassurance. "Probably not," I admitted. Systems resist change, especially when they're functioning effectively for some members, even at others' expense. It usually takes a significant disruption to catalyze transformation. Like showing up with irrefutable documentation of years of unacknowledged contribution and boundary violation, she suggested with a rueful smile. "Something like that," I agreed, returning her smile. "I'm still processing my feelings about it all," she continued, arranging family photos on a shelf with careful attention. "There's lingering resentment sometimes, at having comfortable patterns disrupted, at being held accountable in ways I wasn't before. But there's also this growing recognition that the old system wasn't actually healthy for any of us, including me." Her insight impressed me. The ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously, acknowledging both the discomfort of change and the necessity of it, suggested an emotional maturity I hadn't previously associated with my sister. "I'm still struggling with the financial adjustments," she continued with candid honesty. "The daily reality of living within actual means rather than the lifestyle I wish I had or feel entitled to. But there's also relief in not maintaining appearances I can't afford, in not carrying the constant anxiety of financial precarity, masked by occasional extravagance." As we finished arranging her kitchen, placing modest but attractive dishes on open shelving, Melissa paused with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think our parents would have ever recognized these patterns without your confrontation? Without the concrete evidence you presented?" It was a question I had considered many times over the preceding months. "I'm not sure," I replied honestly. "Dad mentioned they were already beginning to examine family dynamics, partly due to his health scare and mom's therapy. But I think the documentation accelerated a process that might otherwise have continued at a much slower pace, if at all." She nodded, absorbing this perspective. "It's strange to think about how much of our family functioning was invisible to us, or at least unexamined, until you forced it into the light, like fish not recognizing they're in water because it's just everywhere, the only environment they've ever known." The metaphor was apt, suggesting a depth of reflection that continued to surprise me. "Family systems are like that," I agreed. "The patterns become so familiar, they seem inevitable rather than chosen, natural rather than constructed. And changing them feels almost physically uncomfortable," she added. "Like trying to write with your non-dominant hand, awkward, requiring constant conscious effort, with a constant pull back toward the familiar even when you know it's not optimal." As evening approached and the apartment took on the settled appearance of an actual home rather than a collection of boxes, Melissa ordered takeout from a modestly priced local restaurant, another small but notable shift from her previous insistence on premium options regardless of budget constraints. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Winters said in our last session," she mentioned as we ate at her new dining table. A simple but elegant piece she had found at a consignment store, rather than the high-end furniture showrooms she would have patronized in the past. About how the healthiest family relationships involve flexible boundaries, firm enough to maintain individual autonomy, but permeable enough to allow authentic connection. I nodded, recalling the discussion. "Finding that balance is challenging," I acknowledged, especially when established patterns have leaned heavily toward either rigid separation or excessive enmeshment. "We were definitely on the enmeshment end of the spectrum," Melissa observed. with patterns of accommodation and caretaking that created dependencies rather than healthy interdependence. I'm trying to figure out what healthy connection looks like without those old dynamics. Me too, I admitted. It's new territory for all of us. As I prepared to leave, Melissa embraced me with unusual warmth and sincerity. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for helping today, but for having the courage to disrupt patterns that weren't serving any of us well, even when doing so was uncomfortable and faced resistance." The acknowledgement, freely offered without external prompting or obvious advantage to be gained, felt like confirmation of genuine change rather than temporary accommodation to altered circumstances. "We're figuring it out together," I replied, returning her embrace. The 6-month mark after the property closing brought a family gathering at my house, a casual Sunday brunch to celebrate my father's birthday. As we assembled around the dining table, I noticed subtle but significant shifts in our family dynamics. My mother, who had historically directed most of her attention and conversational energy toward Melissa, made visible efforts to engage equally, with both daughters asking thoughtful questions about my recent work projects and actually listening to the responses, rather than waiting for an opening to redirect focus to my sister. My father, always more balanced in his attention but historically conflict avoidant, demonstrated a new willingness to address tension directly when it emerged. When a brief disagreement arose about holiday planning, he facilitated a straightforward discussion of competing needs and preferences rather than smoothing over differences to maintain surface harmony. Most notably, Melissa participated without dominating, offering opinions without expecting them to automatically carry more weight than others, expressing needs clearly but without manipulation or strategic displays of emotion. When the conversation turned to her recent promotion at work, a genuine achievement in her real estate career, she shared her satisfaction without the exaggerated self-congratulation that had characterized similar announcements in the past. "I'm finding there's actual satisfaction in earning recognition through consistent effort," she mentioned as we discussed her new role. "Different from the validation I used to seek through more performative means." This self-awareness, offered without obvious strategic purpose, suggested genuine growth rather than calculated impression management. Throughout the meal, similar small indicators of transformation emerged. My mother noting when she caught herself centering Melissa's preferences in planning decisions. My father acknowledging moments of reflexive conflict avoidance. Melissa recognizing instances of entitlement thinking without defensiveness or deflection. None of these changes suggested complete transformation of deeply ingrained patterns. There were still moments of backsliding, still hints of old dynamics emerging in subtle ways, but the direction of movement was consistently toward greater awareness, accountability, and balance. Progress rather than perfection. As we cleared dishes after the meal, my mother joined me in the kitchen, her movements suggesting a certain tentativeness that wasn't typical of her usual confident efficiency. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said, arranging plates with unusual focus. "Something that's been on my mind since we began this family. Recalibration." I waited, giving her space to formulate her thoughts. "Was it lonely?" she asked finally, looking up to meet my eyes directly. "All those years being the responsible one, the accommodating one, the one whose needs were considered secondary. Did you feel isolated within the family?" The question touched something deep within me, a core experience I had rarely articulated even to myself. "Yes," I admitted quietly. "There was a particular loneliness in being seen, but not truly recognized, in having my contributions accepted but not acknowledged, in being needed but not necessarily valued for anything beyond practical support." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I've been thinking a lot about what that must have been like for you. How I, helped create that isolation through patterns I never consciously examined." The acknowledgement, offered without deflection or qualification, felt like the closing of a circle that had begun with my presentation of the property documentation months earlier. The recognition not just of practical contributions overlooked, but of emotional impact unrecognized. "I can't change the past," she continued, her voice steady despite her evident emotion. "But I want you to know that I see it now. The patterns, the imbalances, the ways we failed to honor your place in the family properly. And I'm committed to doing better moving forward, even when that means confronting my own tendencies toward favoritism and conflict avoidance." The straightforward acknowledgement of dynamics I had felt but never expected to hear named by my mother left me momentarily speechless. "Thank you," I managed finally. "That means more than you know." Later that evening, after my parents and sister had departed, I sat on the back porch of my officially owned home, watching twilight settle over the garden my mother and I had recently replanted together, a collaborative project that would have been unimaginable within our former dynamics. The property deed that had catalyzed our family's transformation now hung framed in my home office, a reminder not just of legal ownership, but of the power of bringing hidden truths into the light. The journey we had undertaken over the past months hadn't been comfortable or easy for any of us. There had been resistance, resentment, moments of regression to established roles and comfortable scripts. Yet beneath the inevitable fluctuations ran a current of fundamental change, the recognition of contributions long minimized, the establishment of boundaries long ignored, the development of relationships based on mutual respect rather than entrenched patterns of giving and taking. As night fully descended, I reflected on the strange power of that original property deed, a simple legal document that had somehow unlocked truths too long unspoken and catalyzed transformations too long deferred. In making visible what had been deliberately overlooked, it had created space for new awareness, new patterns, new possibilities. Sometimes the quietest person in the room really is the one holding all the cards. And sometimes it takes showing those cards to change the game entirely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.